Greetings. My talk today is about fostering disability inclusion and empowering neurodivergent library workers. I'm Christine Moeller, and I use they or she pronouns. I identify as white, queer, neurodivergent, and disabled, and I'm an academic librarian and currently a second-year PhD student at the University of Washington iSchool. I want to acknowledge the University of Washington stands on the stolen ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. As the conference land acknowledgement notes, quote, "We need to learn, protect, and honor the history and people of the places we each individually live in, and honor the lives of all who endured and continue to endure settler colonial oppression and white supremacy." I will add that so too do we need to fully acknowledge and critically reflect on the histories of dispossession and forced removal that have allowed for the growth and survival of each of our institutions. I commit to that, and I hope you will as well. In this lightning talk, I will give a brief overview of the neurodiversity paradigm, share a few lessons we can learn from critical disability studies, and suggest some starting places for fostering neurodiversity inclusion in library workplaces. We'll begin with neurodiversity and normalizing neurological differences. The word neurodiversity was coined by Judy Singer in the 1990s in recognition that differences among brains and minds are a normal part of human variation. Neurodiversity also stands in opposition to the pathology paradigm, which frames individual differences as deficits in need of a remedy. Within the neurodiversity paradigm, people whose minds do not align with dominant societal expectations are considered neurodivergent, such as autistic people or people with ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's, and other forms of neurological differences. The neurodiversity paradigm is important to library workplaces because, as Jess Schomburg argues, creating a truly inclusive workplace includes normalizing body and performance differences in our workplace policies and practices, as well as in the language we use to describe disability. Unfortunately, while the library literature does address neurodiversity, it focuses predominantly on neurodivergent patrons and thus largely fails to recognize the existence of neurodivergent library workers. The library literature also draws heavily on pathological or medical understandings of neurodiversity, which frame neurodiversity as an individual deficit and often reproduce harmful stereotypes of neurodivergent people. Studies on the experiences of disabled librarians and research from other fields on neurodiversity employment demonstrate that neurodivergent people face numerous barriers to workplace inclusion, including harmful stereotypes, isolation and exclusion, improper sensory environments, and poor supervisory relationships. And if librarians are to truly embrace neurodiversity, as Emily Lawrence writes, they must cultivate the requisite knowledge and sensitivities to make the profession safe for a wide variety of persons who present in a range of different ways. So although the library literature is limited, we can look to other disciplines, such as critical disability studies, to help us build to that knowledge and sensitivity. By viewing our workplaces through the lens of critical disability studies, we can examine, critique, and disrupt dominant norms and ideologies that impact disabled and neurodivergent library workers. Additionally, critical disability studies recognizes that we live in our bodies within a social context and environment, and it acknowledges that disability is interwoven with other forms of oppression, such as race, gender, sexuality, age, and class. Critical disability studies also seeks to radically disrupt multiple sociological ideologies that assign more value to some bodies and minds than others. This lens of critical disability studies teaches us that we need to surface and disrupt ableism, which is a prejudice and discrimination against disabled people that is often apparent through social norms, expectations, and policies. We also learn that the word disability does not have a negative connotation, and that differences are normal and not impairments in need of remedies. Disability studies is an evolving field that covers much more than I can address today, so I want to move on to discuss how to begin making improvements in our library workspaces. Research on neurodiversity in the workplace and the voices and perspectives of neurodivergent people themselves can help us learn how to foster neurodiversity inclusion and break down barriers in library workplaces. In a study on the attitudes of library workers toward disability, J.J. Pianke found that library management is generally seen as a barrier to inclusion and accessibility. Yet the good news is that studies show that managers can play an important role in minimizing or eliminating barriers experienced by neurodivergent employees. Managers can have a positive impact on the organizational culture, can support or lead efforts to design for accessibility, and have the direct ability to empower their neurodivergent employees. Neurodiversity is a broad category, and each neurodivergent is different and will have their own needs. But many of the practices that support neurodivergent employees are the same practices you may already use as a thoughtful and supportive manager. One way that managers can influence organizational culture is by setting and modeling norms and expectations, such as using sick days and vacation time, or using flex time, or working from home. These practices can help support the needs of neurodivergent employees, as well as many others in library workplaces. It is also important that managers disrupt ableism and harmful stereotypes, as you would with other forms of oppression and marginalization. That means intervening in the moment, yes, but that also means working to prevent such incidents from occurring, such as through providing professional development focused on neurodiversity acceptance. Library managers can also help their libraries design workspaces for physical and sensory accessibility, which includes factors such as noise levels and lighting. Too often, accessibility is created through retrofits or adaptations to existing structures that can highlight differences. Instead, we need to consider how to redesign library spaces to be more welcoming to disabled and neurodivergent employees and to suit their needs. Universal design is a helpful framework for considering a variety of needs in our library environments. Universal design for learning, which applies universal design to learning spaces, can be helpful beyond classrooms and is relevant to workplaces as well. For example, you can use multiple means of representation in library meetings instead of relying solely on verbal communication. Neurodivergent employees may benefit from a written agenda that helps them know what to expect, or meeting notes that address what was discussed, or a follow-up email that includes a written summary or provides reminders of key takeaways from the conversation. Library managers can help empower neurodivergent employees by making sure their workplace needs are met. Rather than solely requiring an accommodation, which creates an additional burden for neurodivergent employees and usually requires disclosing diagnoses, managers can take proactive steps toward addressing the needs of their employees in ways that support neurodivergent workers. For example, you can ask employees questions like, what is your preferred method of communication? Some neurodivergent people may prefer face-to-face conversations, while others prefer written forms of communication. You can also ask employees questions such as, is your workspace meeting your needs? Or what processes are working for you and where can we make improvements? These types of questions recognize that differences are normal and allow employees to articulate their specific needs. Because neurodivergent employees face so many barriers to inclusion, including stigma, you may not know that you have neurodivergent employees, and that's why it is so vital to be proactive. I hope these small steps you can take as a library manager are only the beginning of the ongoing work to make library workplaces more inclusive of neurodivergent people. You are welcome to reach out to me at my UW email address shown here, and I look forward to sharing more of this work with you soon as I continue my PhD research in this area. As you can see, here are the references that I have cited in this talk if you are interested in learning more. And thank you for taking the time to listen. I look forward to hearing your questions.